So, hello. Hey,
Hey,
everybody.
Pat,
Hey,
glad to be here, man.
all right. So I'm gonna start by just saying a few things, and then I'm gonna ask you guys questions, and then we'll have a dialogue. I had spoken a little bit earlier today that the type of youth that we want everybody to be leaving here today, saying, I have an urgent need to get this young person into a permanent family with a permanent parent. um, is if it's what Michelle was talking about. We have thousands of children in the United States of America being discharged to nobody but themselves at some point between 18, 19, 20, or 21. But they are living in what I would basically call a round hole family or facility right now. Their greatest need is a parent and a family, and they're living perhaps in a residential treatment center, or a group care, or a traditionally prepared foster home, or therapeutic foster homes that have no intention on them staying there beyond the last day in care. So we have lots of kids living in those facilities right now. And those young people need for us to have a paradigm shift in regard to what their greatest need is. And whatever need is being treated in those places, it's just temporary, and their greatest need is permanent. And we have to figure out a way to bring that to that young person. So I invited my dear friend, Bryan Post, who I met literally about 16 years ago when he was just a baby, really. He basically just finished writing a book, one of my favorite books at all, Beyond Consequences. And he wrote to me. He saw an article that I wrote because he was already working with families. He was already really, really strongly figuring out that the kids' greatest needs are having family. But there was that piece that was missing. That was that commitment piece. And the article that I had wrote was essentially called Unconditional Commitment, the only love that matters. And it impressed him enough that he reached out to me. And I was just wondering if you could recall that, Bryan, and then just tell us a little bit about how in your professional world, how really trying to get kids into permanent families has shifted, at least since we met.
Well, I do recall, Pat, first learning of you and your information, and one of the things that was particularly inspiring for me is that you were a passionate voice in support of children, and also the importance of children having families at all ages, kids being adopted at all ages. And it's not a common voice. And so that, obviously you're a man who speaks your mind, and I particularly enjoy that about you. And so we have continued to do this work specifically around these aging out youth. And this is how I adopted my own son. He was a child in our group home, came to live with us at 15 after being in 10 years. It was about 8 years of care in every institution in Virginia. And so he was with us in our group home for 2.5 years, because he was just about to turn 16. And then we decided we were going to move back to Oklahoma. And he was one of the only kids in the program that didn't have anywhere else to go. And so the options for him were to go to an adult group home or to some other transitional organization, and none of those had been successful up until he came to live in our group home. And so we decided to just bring him home with us. And that was over 10 years ago. And he's continuing to thrive. And funny enough, that same group home, I just had a series of text messages from another young man who's still, he's on his life journey, but he also knows I'm someone he can reach out to when he needs to. The need just, it almost increases over where it is when the child is in care. Because when the child is in care, you're placing them in these systems, whether it's homes or group homes or what have you. But when they turn 18, they're number one, we don't focus on the importance of relationship while we have these children in care. And because we don't, let me make a distinction, we focus on behaviors. And so the opposite to relationship is behavior. our society and our institutions of care are heavily steeped on behavior management. And so all of the real focus and core of treatment becomes behavior focused. The problem with that is that a child grows up feeling like something's wrong with them. They feel like they're bad and they feel like no one loves them. And they never get to form relationships. So then when they turn 18, they don't have secure relationships to help them anchor to a community or to a family. And it's really, really hard. And I obviously have worked with families all around the world. And right now I have an organization that I run in Northern California. So I see this every single day. I mean, I've got three kids of 18 to 21 right now, just in our program that we continue to support into independent living. So it is a huge need. It's always been a big need. And I think that we need to continue to bring more attention to it.
Thank you, Bryan. I want to introduce our next guest, but I want to be very specific, policy-wise, why we really wanted to speak to Michael Plumb today. In New York State, you got to believe, has always licensed families, and they were permanent families, and they trained them to be permanent families. However, when we started, that was the only way we could do it. We had to use the foster care system to get the kids and the foster care license to get the young people a permanent home. Then something materialized years after we started, you got to believe, called subsidized kinship guardianship. And in New York State, the only families that are not allowed to do subsidized kinship guardianship are families where a young person moved into a foster home and they did not previously have a relationship with the family, which is essentially half of all of you gotta believe's families, because they were recruited to be permanent. They used the foster care license to get them that permanency. And that's the only family that's not qualified by New York State rules to actually get the young person and the family out of the system through the subsidized kinship guardianship program. Well, Michael Plumb works for ODHS, Child Welfare Adoption and Guardianship Assistance Program in Oregon, and they actually do some work with foster families and guardianship, and that's why we asked Mike to say a few words about how they utilize the guardianship system to get kids to get kids permanent families, and they allow their foster families to become that permanent family. So, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Good morning, everyone. So, as he indicated, I work in the state of Oregon for the child welfare system. Started my work here in Oregon as a social worker in the homeless and runaway youth sector outside of child welfare, and then shifted into casework and a number of other roles over the years. And currently my role is in the Adoption and Guardianship Assistance Program, supporting permanent families and setting up some benefits for them and supporting them as a consultant ongoing. In the state of Oregon, initially, as Pat indicated for New York, it was also in Oregon that we had the rules for the 4E waiver when the GAP program first came into place. It was only for relatives, and it was very restrictive in our case planning for those kids that just didn't have safe and willing relatives that could be a placement for them in their particular circumstance. And we couldn't offer the same sorts of access to ongoing medical and perhaps a subsidy payment to families to be able to make that a viable long-term placement for them to be the permanent family for that child in that circumstance. Now, they could do permanent guardianship or they could do permanent foster care and continue to have a caseworker showing up and the court hearings and all the external stuff about foster care that is completely not family friendly and not family oriented. But many kids did not want that. They wanted something more permanent and more normal. Their words. They wanted something more normal. They wanted their family to not include a caseworker showing up every month to do their home visits. So Oregon went through the process, and we modified our rules to define a foster parent that had had a child for at least 12 of the last 24 months as a fully certified home, to be then, for the purposes of guardianship, a relative. Now, it doesn't change everything, but it changed legal status for the purposes of guardianship. So we made it so that they could access the same sort of resources to be that guardian and a permanent resource for that child, and be able to receive supportive services like relative families. So they're not having to look at, can we do this permanently without the supportive things that have been in place in the foster care system. So allowing those supports to remain in place and those families to be able to step forward without the same sort of fear and uncertainty around, can we be that permanent resource? So we do still have a vast majority of our placements as relative placements in the state of Oregon. There's a lot of value for us in engaging relatives early, as soon as a child is deemed unsafe in the assessment process. But when it's not the case, when that's not, those resources don't come to light and can't be approved for relative foster care, why would we leave a welcoming family out in the cold? So in Oregon, we've made that accessible and have found a lot of success in that.
All right, and we're going to get back to all our panelists, but I just wanted to get the fundamental ideas out. And I am actually meeting Jennifer Townsend for the first time. Hi, Jennifer. I see that you are the Vice President of Children and Youth Services for Foster Adopt Connect. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that's the Missouri or Kansas side.
Both.
Oh, okay, good. So,
Yeah.
I wasn't too far off there.
Yeah.
And you can share anything that you want to share with us about this, but I understand that you're working very closely with a program I'm going to call the Soul Project that Casey had introduced you guys to. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that program and anything else that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, of course. I actually think that the senior associate from Annie, Casey, Doreen Chapman, who we've worked very closely with on bringing Soul to Kansas, is on this call. So hi, Doreen. Okay, so I've enjoyed so much of what I've heard already. I have to share that, you know, as a child, my cousin came into care when her parents passed away from drug abuse and alcohol abuse. And while she found legal guardianship with our grandmother, my grandmother was illiterate and needed significant support when it came to court and schooling. And so my mother entered a sort of informal, additional parenting figure role for her for the remainder of life, still to this day. And I share that because one of the things that has interested me the most about Soul, or support opportunity unity and legal relationships, is that it offers the opportunity for youth-led permanency, in which you do not need to terminate the biological parent's rights, and you can finalize legal permanency with multiple options. And so if we had that option back when my cousin originally came into care, we likely would have entered legal guardianship with both my grandmother and my mother. Another really cool piece of that caught my attention was that also allows the youth to maintain legal relationship with their siblings, and even for two siblings to have the same soul family, even if they're placed in different locations. An additional sort of catch your eye, get excited aspect of Soul is that we are really pushing for implementation of Soul in states and working with states to continue significant support to those families and to the children and youth that we're serving once permanency is finalized. And so as we know, there is in most states a significant drop in potential supports that a child or youth can receive once they finalize legal permanency. And we don't think that that's good for most of our children. And so, and honestly, there are so many details about SOL that I could get into, but it's actually very simple. SOL listened to young adults, they listen to teenagers, they listen to youth who are in foster care or have been in foster care, and they asked them what they needed, and they asked them how we could improve, and we asked what was missing. And while it was determined that adoption still has a place, that legal guardianship still has a place, certainly reunification still has a place, that families are so much more varied than that. They have varied needs, youth have varied needs, and that there was a gap in options for youth and for their families. They wanted another option in which they would be listened to, in which families, whether that's a relative or a kinship resource or maybe a foster parent they've been with for a long time, in which they were all engaged in the process in healthy communication and healthy support, just to give another option to the folks that we're working with. And I guess back to my own origin for just a moment, it's so innovative, we're almost circling back around to these sort of family units that actually occur in nature without legal interference or without the child welfare system's involvement. If you were to look at families, not only in your state, in the country, around the world, there are families that are functioning just like this. They just don't have the legal support and recognition that SOL can provide them, and specifically can provide for these youth that are in care right now. And so we've been able to bring that to Kansas. Kansas is the first state that's going to be implementing SOL. And so right now we are at the point that we are working with young adults, youth, stakeholders there in Kansas to figure out more of the details of implementation of SOL in the state of Kansas. And so what does this mean legally? What does this mean financially? And more important than anything else, what does this mean for youth and the families that are working with them? So.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hey, if someone could just tell me what time this workshop, this segment is over, just so I don't go over. I'd appreciate it if you just slip it in the box. But let me ask the panel now. We have people from all over the country. They know young people that are about to be, at some point, the plan is to discharge them from foster care, essentially to nobody but themselves. And do you have any specific advice what they can do instead? I mean, they're giving them whatever program they're giving them, but that's what I've come to call a round hole program. It's temporary, and these young people need permanent. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice for what they might be able to paradigm shift today so they can start working a second plan for that young person tomorrow?
Well, I think, Pat, that we use the word transition, but we don't always act from that capacity. You know, these children, these youth need to have an opportunity to transition. And if a young person is coming from foster care and they are transitioning into adulthood, now we know that brain development for that child is not even near completion. At the very least, if we could connect them to a community, a community would allow them, it would give them a central point of connection. It would permit more flexibility because you wouldn't have an adult, because almost all these children are immune to any kind of authority by the time that they've gone through the system. They're tired of people moving them around and telling them what they can do and what they can't do. So if you don't have a solid enough relationship to influence them, you got to have a community that allows them the flexibility and the support to be able to start to stumble out into the world as an adult. So a community as a point of transition could be a very, very important thing.
All right, so let me challenge that. Only because when we started, you got to believe, we realized that almost to say it's up to the community, or it takes a village to raise a child or a youth. I've always fed back, only if you have a parent in that village or somebody functioning in that way.
Yes.
So when I was a kid, the village was my block. If I did something that somebody didn't like, they would tell me to stop. But the only reason why I would stop is because I know they would go down and talk to my parents. And every parent that we find is a member of a community. And no parent can do everything by themselves, and they need the support of the village. But without the foundation of that family, how does a community offer anything when that's so, on some level, nebulous? What does that mean?
The foundation you're talking about is a central regulatory figure. So a child has to have a central regulatory figure, or a primary one or a secondary one. And if I think just about the kids in our organization right now, for many of these kids, I am a central regulatory figure for them. So whether that's a text message, a phone call, a hug, an interaction, but if it's not me, I know I have another staff person they go to. So they'll call me Papa, and they'll call her Mama. And so you're absolutely right that within that community, the hope is that you have some supportive central regulatory figures that those kids can connect to. One of the challenges, though, is we are so non-relational. We are so non-relational, and you can assign someone a parent, but if that parent is not relational, if that parent is not flexible, it's just more of the same for that child. So I use the concept of a community as a central point to where the child feels like they can be a part of something. Obviously, if we could have a set of primary regulatory figures within that community for that child, it's got to be more ideal.
Jennifer, Michael, do you have anything you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I think that this is relevant, but maybe seems like a little bit left of center. But I would love folks to take a look at the communication that is occurring with foster parents about biological parents and how they can be part of a community together. I'm also a former foster parent and an adoptive parent who sees my children's first mother every other weekend. Most of the parents, even if they've lost their parental rights to the children, it doesn't mean they don't love their children. It doesn't mean they don't have an important role in their children's lives. If there is not an immediate and impending, safety issue, for the most part, you can help foster that relationship, and you can be a family, and you can be a community, and open that community up to a larger village. And I just think that if that was done more on the front end, we would have better results about the teenagers we're talking about today.
And I totally agree with the front end part. We need to do, and we are trying to narrow the front door so less and less kids come into foster care. And we're all on board with that, which is excellent. When I had left the day-to-day management of You Gotta Believe about 10 years ago, I was planning to go on a 2-year sabbatical, and I didn't go to any other country to do that. I wound up going to the state of Connecticut. And what I did in the state of Connecticut is I actually became a Wendy's Wonderful Kids recruiter. And in that period of time, I was assigned a caseload of young people between the ages of 16 and 18, on the verge of aging out, all living in congregate care facilities. And just about every one of those young people had somebody in their life who truly loved them, who truly cared about them, and would come forward for that young person, go through the licensing process, go through the training process, and become that central regulatory figure that Bryan was talking about. And of course, we talk as the central parent figure. But the thing is, the thing that always amazed me is every young person already has somebody in their life who love and care about them. And then it's our job to reach out to those people and bring them into this process, first as a learning experience, and then than to do what needs to be done to get that young person a family before they age out. So that's another type of idea and program as well.
So Pat, one thing
Michael, go
I'd
ahead.
like to add to that is just expanding our view beyond just placement recruiting. We're really helping these children develop their village, their family, however that's defined, not by blood ties, not by legal ties, but who are the people that are there and already willing to pour into them. And in the cases where we say, oh gosh, there just isn't anybody, helping them develop that.
Right.
And that's really part of our role in helping them as they launch into the rest of their life.
Okay. I'm looking in the questions to see if there's any specific questions for this panel. So I'm not seeing anything there. So anything else that we can offer as terms of a policy or a call to action for when people leave today? What is something that we would like them to start doing that might be a slight paradigm shift tomorrow for the young people in care that they know? That's open to the panel.
Start focusing more on understanding stress and trauma and how trauma impacts these children's brains, makes them more sensitive, and then also how caregivers have their own trauma that they bring to the table. And if we can focus on helping caregivers understand their own trauma and understand themselves and their own reactive patterns more effectively, then we can help them remain more present for these kids while they're trying to work through and struggling through their own traumas and their own histories. And in that process, we can build much, much stronger relationships.
All right. Anything else that anybody would like to call for a cause of action of what people can start doing with young people on their caseloads right now? Different. What can they do different starting tomorrow?
I don't think that this is new. It's a reminder, I guess,
Right.
to just take the time to really listen to the kids that you're working with, the youth you're working with, and listen more than you talk, and look for opportunities in everything they say. Sometimes we're so overwhelmed that we look for reasons why something won't work out. So if he wants to go live with his friend's parents, I'm seeing all the reasons why that won't work out. Or if he wants to be adopted by his older brother, it's easier to just check mark the reasons it won't work out. Don't do that. Take the time, sit with it, breathe with it, and look for opportunities to make it work, because they're just worth it.
All right. And we do have a question in the box. What are some of the strategies you have successfully used to ensure the ongoing commitment to youth? The system is so weighed down by kids returning to care. What are some of the strategies that any of you might have utilized?
Well, I definitely think our efforts to increase our diligent search for relatives and placing children in their community is paramount. But I also think that continued post-permanency supports and getting those out to some of our more rural communities is huge, and destigmatizing the need for additional assistance post-adoption. So oftentimes we hear that adoptive parents are hesitant to come forward when they're struggling for fear that they will be under the microscope, and that will somehow hurt them or the other children in your home. And so we've got to have more open communication.
All right. And we're getting close to the end of our time. And we've been getting lots of calls for some people who came late. They want to know the definition of moral adoption. And I did not write it down. And I was wondering if anybody from the Gotta Believe Network, Jennifer, or anybody else, can read that definition one more time before we go on to the next stage.